She sheltered a bleeding man during a storm, not knowing he was a feared Mafia boss who... Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. I still remember the sound the rain made that night. How it hit the tin awning outside my small rental like 1,000 impatient fingers tapping all at once. How the wind pushed against the walls as if it wanted inside just as badly as I did. I was 27, exhausted, and counting every dollar in my checking account. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after working back-to-back shifts and pretending everything is fine when it isn't. My house sat at the edge of a quiet road, nothing but dark trees and wet asphalt around it. The kind of place you choose because it's cheap, not because it feels safe. I had just kicked off my shoes and set my keys down when I heard it, a dull sound outside. Not loud enough to be thunder, not sharp enough to be a branch snapping, just wrong. I told myself to ignore it, told myself storms make strange noises, that fear has a way of inventing problems. But then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by a low, unsteady breath that didn't belong to the wind. I cracked the door open an inch and the cold rushed in, rain blowing sideways, soaking my sleeves in seconds. And that's when I saw him slumped near the steps. One hand braced against the railing, the other pressed tight against his side, as if he was trying to hold himself together. He looked out of place, even like that, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark jacket soaked through, his face pale under the porch light, eyes sharp despite the pain he was clearly trying not to show. For a long second, we just stared at each other, the storm roaring between us, and every warning I'd ever learned about strangers flashed through my mind. He didn't beg, didn't rush toward me, didn't do anything dramatic at all, just stood there breathing hard, rainwater and something darker mixing on the concrete below him. I should have closed the door. I know that now. But something about the way he held himself, controlled even when he was clearly struggling, made it impossible to see him as a threat in that moment. I grabbed a towel from the hall closet and stepped back, opening the door wider, my voice shaking as I told him he could come in, just until the storm passed. He hesitated, like he was measuring the room, the distance, me, then nodded once and crossed the threshold, leaving wet footprints on my floor. The moment the door shut behind him, the noise of the storm faded, replaced by the sound of my own heartbeat, fast and loud. And I had no idea that letting that man into my house wasn't just sheltering a stranger from the rain. It was the first step into a world I never imagined I'd touch. I led him toward the kitchen, every step measured, every instinct alert, yet strangely calm, as if my body had already decided before my mind could catch up. I told him to sit on the chair by the counter, the sturdy one I used when I needed to reach the top shelves, and he obeyed without argument, lowering himself carefully like someone used to pain but unwilling to show it. Up close, I could see how controlled he was, the way his jaw tightened instead of groaning, the way his eyes tracked every movement I made, not in fear, but in assessment. I filled a bowl with warm water from the tap, grabbed the cleanest towels I owned, and told myself this was no different than helping an injured neighbor, that storms bring strangers together all the time, that kindness does not require permission. He introduced himself as Dominic, his voice low, steady, almost polite, and I gave him my name in return, surprised by how normal that exchange felt considering the circumstances. When I asked where he was hurt, he hesitated just long enough for me to notice, then nodded toward his side, saying it was not as bad as it looked, a phrase people use when they want you to believe them. I knelt beside him, careful not to crowd his space, and asked before touching him, a habit drilled into me from a lifetime of respecting boundaries, and he inclined his head in a way that felt more like a decision than consent. I worked slowly, blotting away rainwater, focusing on my breathing so my hands would not shake, aware of the heat radiating from him, the contrast between his soaked jacket and the warmth of my small kitchen. He watched me the entire time, not with discomfort, but with a kind of quiet intensity, like he was memorizing the room, the sound of the clock on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the storm rattled the windows. At one point, I noticed him flinch at a particularly loud crack of thunder, not out of fear, but calculation, his head tilting slightly, as if he were listening for something else beneath the noise. And that was when I felt it, the first real prickle of unease, the sense that this man was not just passing through my life by accident. Still, he thanked me, genuinely, not in a way meant to charm, but with the weight of someone unaccustomed to being helped without strings attached. I offered him coffee, then thought better of it and brought water instead, and he accepted with a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping, sheets of it pouring down the road, turning headlights into blurred streaks of light in the distance, and I realized how isolated my house really was, how alone we were out there together. When I asked if someone was looking for him, his gaze lifted to mine, sharp and unreadable, and he said no, not tonight, a simple answer that somehow raised more questions than it settled. I told him he could stay until the storm passed, until he felt steady enough to leave, and he studied my face for a long moment before nodding, as if weighing the truth of my words against something only he could see. As I cleaned up the kitchen, stacking towels, wiping the counter, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy, I felt the air shift, subtle but unmistakable, the way it does when something important has already happened and you just have not realized it yet. I had opened my door to a stranger to keep him dry. That was all. I told myself, just shelter from a storm, just a small act of kindness on a long night, never suspecting that the man sitting quietly in my kitchen carried a world with him that would soon make my quiet life feel very far away. The storm stretched on longer than I expected, the rain steady and relentless, as if the night itself had decided to linger, and Dominic remained seated at my kitchen counter, composed in a way that felt practiced rather than accidental. I noticed how he never truly relaxed, how even when he leaned back slightly, his posture stayed ready, balanced, like a man who slept lightly even in safe places. I busied myself with small tasks, rinsing the bowl, folding the damp towels, anything to keep my hands moving, yet my attention kept drifting back to him, to the quiet authority he carried without effort. At one point, his phone buzzed softly in his pocket, the sound barely audible over the rain, but his reaction was immediate, his gaze sharpening as he checked the screen and then slipped the phone back without answering. He caught me watching and offered a faint smile, apologetic, explaining it was nothing important, just a missed call, but something in his tone suggested he was choosing his words carefully. I asked if he wanted me to call someone for him, a friend or family member, and he shook his head, saying it would only complicate things, another phrase that sounded rehearsed, like it belonged to a life where complications were expected rather than avoided. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, finally allowing myself to look at him openly, noticing details I had missed before, the expensive cut of his jacket despite the wear, the faint accent that softened certain words, the way his eyes never lingered on objects but on exits, windows, reflections. When a car passed on the road outside, headlights sweeping briefly across the walls, he went still, listening, counting seconds under his breath without realizing he was doing it, and then relaxed only when the sound faded completely. He noticed my expression and said he had learned to be cautious, that old habits were hard to break, and I nodded, accepting that answer because pushing felt dangerous in a way I could not explain. I told him the road did not see much traffic at night, that most people avoided it when storms hit, and he acknowledged that with a thoughtful hum, as if he were mapping the area in his mind. Time moved strangely after that, minutes stretching thin, the storm isolating us from the rest of the world, and I realized how easily silence settled between us, not awkward, but heavy with things unsaid. He thanked me again, more quietly this time, for opening the door, for not asking questions he was not ready to answer, and I shrugged it off, saying anyone would have done the same, though even as I spoke, I knew that was not true. When the rain finally began to ease, the sound shifting from a roar to a steady patter, he stood slowly, testing his balance, and I felt an unexpected tension coil in my chest at the thought of him leaving, as if the night had not finished with us yet. He asked if he could wash his hands before he went, his manners precise, almost old-fashioned, and I gestured toward the sink, watching as he rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms marked not by roughness, but by strength held in check. As he dried his hands, He met my eyes and said something that stayed with me long after. That kindness was rare when people believed it cost them something, and that he would remember this night. The way he said it did not sound like a promise meant to flatter, but a statement of fact. And as he stepped back toward the door, the storm finally loosening its grip on the world outside, I had the sudden, unsettling sense that whatever I had given him that night, shelter, silence, trust, it was not finished giving back to me. He paused at the doorway longer than necessary, one hand resting lightly on the frame, as if he were listening to something beyond the rain-soaked quiet, and I realized then that leaving was not a simple act for him, that departures carried weight in his world. The porch light cast a soft glow over his face, revealing an expression I could not quite read, something thoughtful, guarded, almost conflicted, and when he finally stepped outside, the night seemed to swallow him too quickly, leaving the house feeling larger and emptier than before. I locked the door and leaned against it, surprised by the tightness in my chest, telling myself it was just the adrenaline wearing off, just the echo of an unexpected encounter on a long night. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of rain and footsteps, of voices just out of reach, and when morning arrived, pale and quiet, I tried to convince myself that Dominic had been nothing more than a stranger passing through. But the day refused to return to normal. As I went about my routine, making coffee, checking my phone, getting ready for work, I kept replaying small details, the way he had scanned the room, the careful choice of words, the sense of control that never left him even when he was hurt. On my drive into town, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street from the diner where I stopped for breakfast, its windows dark, engine idling, and though I told myself it was coincidence, my grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I shook it off, ordered my usual, and focused on the familiar comfort of coffee and toast, yet the feeling of being observed lingered, subtle but persistent. Later that afternoon, as clouds gathered again on the horizon, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, and I hesitated before answering, my pulse quickening without reason. His voice on the other end was calm, unmistakable, and he apologized for calling without warning, explaining that he wanted to make sure I was all right after the storm, that he had not meant to leave so abruptly. I asked how he got my number, the question slipping out sharper than I intended, and he acknowledged it with quiet honesty, saying he had resources, that it was not difficult, but that he understood if that made me uncomfortable. It did, though not for the reasons I could easily explain. We spoke for only a few minutes, polite, measured, yet beneath the surface, I sensed a shift, the invisible line between stranger and something more complicated already crossed. He thanked me again, said he hoped we might speak in person sometime under better circumstances, and before I could decide how I felt about that, the call ended, leaving my phone warm in my hand. That evening, the black sedan returned, this time parked farther down the road, and I watched it from my window until it drove away, unease settling deep in my stomach. I began to understand that the night of the storm had not ended when the rain stopped, that the shelter I had offered had opened a door in both our lives. There was a presence now, not threatening, not overt, but unmistakable, like the low hum of power running just beneath the surface of my quiet existence. And as the sky darkened once more and the first drops of rain tapped against the glass, I found myself wondering what kind of man leaves an imprint without ever raising his voice, and what it meant that he had chosen not to let this encounter fade into memory. The sense of being watched did not fade with time. It sharpened, becoming a quiet companion that followed me through ordinary moments, and I began to notice how my world had subtly shifted since the storm. Cars slowed near my house more often than before. Unfamiliar faces appeared at the edge of familiar places, and though no one approached me directly, I felt the presence of intention everywhere, like pressure in the air before another storm breaks. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself I was imagining patterns where none existed, but the truth settled in slowly, undeniable, I was no longer invisible. Dominic called again 2 days later, his voice calm, unhurried, as if he were checking in on a friend rather than a woman whose life he had quietly stepped into. He asked how work had been, whether the road had flooded again, small questions that sounded harmless but felt deliberate, and when I asked him directly if something was wrong, he paused, just long enough for me to hear the weight behind his silence. He told me there were things I did not need to worry about, that some attention was temporary, that it would pass. And though his tone was reassuring, the words themselves carried an implication that unsettled me deeply. That evening, as I locked up the house, I found a small package on my porch, neatly placed, dry despite the damp air, containing a new outdoor light fixture with a note that read simply, "For safety." No name, no explanation, and I knew without asking who it was from. I should have been angry, should have felt my privacy slipping away, but instead, I felt something far more complicated, a strange mix of irritation and relief that someone had noticed, that someone cared enough to act. When the light was installed the next day, the shadows around my house retreated, and with them, some of my fear, though not the questions. Dominic visited for the first time a week later, arriving in the early evening, alone, his presence filling the doorway with the same controlled energy I remembered. He looked stronger now, steadier, the traces of injury gone, replaced by an ease that spoke of recovery and confidence. He did not step inside until I invited him, respecting the boundary with a precision that felt intentional, and when we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the air between us felt charged, not with attraction, but with understanding that something serious needed to be said. He did not explain everything, did not name his world or his position in it, but he did not lie either. He told me that my kindness had placed me in proximity to situations I did not choose, that some people noticed such things and drew the wrong conclusions, and that he had taken steps to make sure those conclusions went no further. I asked him what that meant for me, for my life, and his gaze held mine steadily as he said that I would not be touched, not questioned, not drawn into anything against my will. "You are under my protection," he said quietly, not as a boast, not as a threat, but as a fact he had already decided. The words should have frightened me, yet instead, they settled something inside my chest, because beneath them was a promise of control, of order, in a situation that had begun to feel unpredictable. When he left that night, the house felt different, not smaller, not larger, but anchored, as if an invisible line had been drawn around it. I stood by the window long after his car disappeared down the road, aware that my life had crossed into a space where safety no longer meant solitude, and where the man I had sheltered from the storm had quietly become the one standing between me and dangers I was only beginning to understand. Life settled into an uneasy rhythm after that, one where nothing outwardly dramatic happened, yet everything felt different beneath the surface, as if my days were now layered with meanings I could not fully see. Dominic did not appear often, but his presence was felt in subtle ways. A brief text reminding me to lock the door when the weather turned, a quiet check-in after I worked late, the sense that someone was paying attention when I no longer could afford not to. I told myself I did not owe him anything, that protection offered without request did not create a debt, yet I found myself thinking about him more than I expected, about the calm certainty in his voice, about the way he never asked for gratitude. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, a man I did not recognize lingered near my car, his interest too focused, his questions about directions oddly specific, and before I could decide whether I was being paranoid, my phone rang. Dominic's voice was immediate, firm but controlled, telling me to get into my car and drive, that he would explain later. I did not ask how he knew, only followed his instruction, my heart racing as I pulled away, the man disappearing into the crowd behind me. That night, Dominic came over again, not uninvited, but with an urgency that made the air feel heavier. He sat across from me, hands folded, eyes steady, and for the first time, he spoke more openly, not naming names or places, but acknowledging that there were people who noticed patterns, who watched for weaknesses, and that my kindness had briefly placed me in their line of sight. He told me it was over now, that he had corrected the assumption that I was vulnerable or useful to anyone else, and when I asked what correcting meant, he simply said that misunderstandings had been resolved. There was no pride in his voice, no hint of threat, only finality. I realized then that the protection he offered was not symbolic. It was active, constant, and carefully managed, and that frightened me more than if he had tried to impress me with stories or warnings. I asked him why he cared, why he had not simply walked away after the storm, and he looked at me for a long moment before answering, saying that people remembered who treated them like human beings when they were not at their strongest, that loyalty was not something he demanded, but something he recognized. The word loyalty echoed between us, heavier than affection, heavier than attraction, and I understood that whatever this was between us, it was rooted in something deeper than chance. As the weeks passed, I noticed the world respond differently to me. Doors opening a little faster, problems resolving before they fully formed, a quiet smoothing of rough edges I had grown used to navigating alone. It was unsettling to realize how much effort it took to maintain an ordinary life, and how easily that effort could be influenced by power I had never touched. I confronted Dominic about it, telling him I did not want my life rewritten without my consent, and he listened, truly listened, then agreed to pull back where he could, to let me decide how much distance I wanted. That promise mattered more than the protection itself. Still, when he stood to leave that night, pausing by the door as he always did, I knew the line between us had shifted again. I was no longer just the woman who had offered shelter during a storm, and he was no longer just the man who needed it. We were bound now by choice and consequence, by an understanding that could not be undone, and as I watched him disappear into the quiet night, I felt the strange certainty that whatever came next, I would not be facing it alone. The first real fracture came quietly, not with threats or confrontation, but with a choice I did not make and a consequence I could not ignore. It happened on a morning that looked like any other, sunlight spilling across my kitchen floor, coffee cooling beside my keys, my schedule already full, when I arrived at work to find my name missing from a meeting I was supposed to lead. No explanation, no apology, just a polite adjustment that left me standing on the outside of a decision that affected my future. By lunchtime, a colleague pulled me aside, voice lowered, eyes nervous, and asked what kind of connections I had made recently, because someone very persuasive had called, not asking for favors, but clarifying expectations. In his face, giving way to something attentive, receptive, as if he knew this moment mattered. I told him what had happened, not accusing, just laying out the facts, and watched his understanding settled into his posture, not defensive, but resolved. He admitted that someone in his circle had acted preemptively, believing they were helping, believing that smoothing obstacles was a kindness, and he apologized without qualification, without excuses. I told him that protection without permission felt like control, that my life was not a problem to be solved, and for the first time since we met, his composure faltered, just slightly, as if he had underestimated the weight of his influence. He said he would fix it, immediately, and I surprised both of us by saying no, that fixing it without my involvement would only prove my point. I asked him to let me speak, to let me reclaim what had been shifted, and after a long moment, he agreed, not because he had to, but because he chose to respect the boundary I set. The next day, the meeting was reinstated, explanations offered, apologies issued, and no one mentioned the call, but everyone felt the correction, subtle and complete. Dominic did not take credit, did not linger, did not intrude, and that restraint mattered more than any gesture he could have made. Later, when we sat together in my living room, the quiet between us felt different, heavier, but also clearer, and he told me something he had never said out loud before. That power was easiest to wield when no one questioned it, and hardest when someone you cared about did. He said I had reminded him of limits he had not needed to consider in a long time, and I realized then that the balance between us had shifted, not toward dominance, but toward something rarer, mutual regard. I told him I did not want a shield that decided my path, that if he was going to stand near my life, it had to be as a presence, not a hand on the wheel. He listened, nodded, and promised to let me lead where my life was concerned, even if it went against his instincts. When he left that night, the air felt lighter, not because the danger was gone, but because I had claimed my place within it. I understood then that rescue was not a single act performed in a storm, but a series of choices made afterward, and that sometimes the bravest thing was not being protected, but insisting on being seen as capable. The tension that followed our conversation did not explode. It settled, reshaping itself into something quieter but more deliberate, and I sensed Dominic recalibrating in ways I could not fully see. He stepped back in the ways that mattered, no calls placed on my behalf, no unseen hands smoothing my path, yet the world did not entirely loosen its grip. Instead, it tested the edges, probing gently, as if waiting to see whether the protection around me was still real or merely symbolic. I noticed it first in small disruptions, a sudden delay in a routine permit, a supplier backing out of a commitment without explanation, inconveniences that felt orchestrated rather than random. I handled them myself, stubbornly, determined to prove that I could navigate difficulty without leaning on anyone else. Dominic watched from a distance, present but restrained, his restraint itself a form of discipline I knew did not come naturally to him. One evening, as the sky threatened rain again, I received a message that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, an anonymous warning phrased as concern, advising me to be careful about who I associated with, reminding me that some paths led to consequences. I showed it to Dominic when he came over later, not asking him to fix it, just asking him to see it. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with focus, and he told me calmly that this was the kind of pressure he had hoped to prevent, the soft kind that tried to scare without leaving fingerprints. He asked me what I wanted to do, the question deliberate, respectful, and I realized how far we had come when my answer was immediate. I told him I wanted clarity, not fear, and that if someone was going to test my boundaries, they would do it openly. He nodded once, understanding the choice I was making, and said he would handle the part that did not require my voice, ensuring that the message remained just that, a message and nothing more. The next few days were tense, the air around me charged with anticipation, yet nothing escalated, nothing crossed the line, and gradually, the pressure eased, as if an unseen hand had redirected it elsewhere. Dominic did not explain how, and I did not ask, trusting that some things were better left undefined. What mattered was the result, the quiet return of equilibrium, and the knowledge that he had acted without overshadowing me. When he finally spoke about it, his words were simple, saying that respect was enforced differently than fear, and that people learned faster when they realized a line existed, not when they were punished for approaching it. I looked at him then and saw not just power, but intention, a man choosing restraint because it mattered to someone he cared about. That night, as we sat together listening to the distant rumble of thunder, I understood that protection did not always mean standing in front of danger. Sometimes it meant standing beside someone while they faced it themselves. I thanked him, not for what he did, but for how he did it, and he accepted that gratitude with quiet humility. The storm passed without breaking, and as the rain softened against the windows, I felt a shift inside me, a recognition that the balance we had been negotiating was finally settling into place. I was no longer merely shielded, and he was no longer merely guarding. We were aligned, each choosing the other's strength without diminishing our own, and in that alignment, something steadier than fear, stronger than control, began to take shape. The night it finally felt complete did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, the way understanding often does, slipping into place when you are no longer bracing for it. Dominic came over just before dusk, not because something was wrong, but because nothing was, and that in itself felt significant. We sat on the porch as the sky shifted through shades of gray and blue, the air heavy with the promise of rain that never quite fell, and for the first time since the storm that brought us together, the silence between us felt easy. He told me he would be leaving town for a while, obligations pulling him back into the world he had carefully kept at the edges of my life, and I surprised myself by not feeling fear at the thought of distance. Instead, I felt a steady confidence, rooted not in his presence, but in what had been built between us. I asked him if he ever regretted knocking on my door that night, if he wished he had found shelter somewhere else, somewhere safer, and he looked at me with an honesty that stripped away every title and every layer of control, saying that night had reminded him who he was before power taught him to hide it. He said I had not saved him because he was hurt, but because I saw him as human when he had almost forgotten how to be seen that way. The words settled into me, warm and grounding, and I realized that rescue had never been one-sided. When he stood to leave, there was no urgency, no unspoken warning, just a calm understanding that this was not an ending. He told me that whatever distance lay ahead, I would never be unprotected, not because I belonged to him, but because he chose to stand with me, wherever I decided to go. I told him I did not need a guardian, but I accepted a partner, and the faint smile that crossed his face carried relief more than triumph. After he left, I stayed on the porch, listening to the night, reflecting on how much had changed since I opened my door to a stranger in the rain. My life was still my own, shaped by my choices, my work, my stubborn independence, yet it was also richer, steadier, informed by a connection that did not demand surrender. I understood now that power did not always take. Sometimes it learned to wait, to listen, to adapt, and that strength could exist alongside kindness without diminishing either. As the first stars appeared overhead, I felt the quiet certainty that whatever storms lay ahead, internal or otherwise, I would meet them differently than before, not hardened, not shielded, but grounded in the knowledge that I had faced fear and chosen compassion without losing myself. The man I sheltered had returned to his world, and I remained in mine. Yet the space between those worlds no longer felt vast or hostile. It felt bridged, not by force, but by a single night, a single choice, and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is open a door and trust that both lives will be changed by what crosses the threshold.